The conference room felt smaller when the paper landed on the table and everyone looked to me for explanation. My name is Marcus Hale, 38, and for the last 9 years I had been the senior account director responsible for our biggest client relationship and the forecasts that kept their business and ours aligned. I lived by calendars, client dinners, and Sundays spent double-checking models so nothing surprised anyone on Monday. At home there were 2 kids who thought my laptop was a second parent, and at work I was the quiet person they called when numbers went sideways. The sheet lay between a half-empty coffee cup and a stack of branded notepads, a single page that somehow condensed years of routine into one breathless question. The paper was glossy where it had been printed recently, edges still warmed from the machine. The ink smelled faintly of toner and the coffee left a halo on the corner of one column. I heard the tiny scrape of a chair as the client opposite me shifted forward, eyebrows knitting. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead and a wall clock clicked like a metronome I could not match. My pulse moved faster than the second hand. I remember the way the room folded inward, attention narrowing until my own skin felt too thin against the scrutiny. These were not strangers who wanted a negotiation. These were people who had adopted my cadence. They trusted the rhythm I kept, the months of steady nudging and quiet corrections that made quarterly forecasts reliable enough to build a department around. That trust was the currency I spent most freely, more than bonuses, more than a title. I had come to measure myself by it. To feel it wobble in that moment was almost a physical ache. What was happening then mattered because the numbers on that page calibrated choices. Hiring, inventory, campaign launches, whether the client's product line got an extra million to scale. Forecasts translated into promises and the promises carved paths through other people's months and mortgages. I had built my days to prevent surprises for those people. The models were not abstract to me, they were a map of livelihoods. When a figure diverged from the map, even by a comma, it sent ripples outward in a way that made me count the consequences in private. I could feel the old habits rise up like a reflex. Scan the columns, anchor on the time series, look for the cell where the variance began. Instead, I kept my palms flat on my own printout, feeling the raised texture of the paper and watched faces. The client tilted their head as if listening to a distant radio. My team sat a few chairs down with expressions that were various mixtures of expectancy and doubt. The junior analyst to my left kept her mouth shut but her fingers fidgeted against the pen. The director who had brought the stack of papers cleared his throat and produced a smile that did not reach his eyes. I knew how this could look. I had been the person people trusted to deliver the steady hand that smoothed out jagged quarters. My calendar had become a kind of faith. Nights blurred into models and meetings until I could read a pivot table in my sleep. I gave up small certainties, missed soccer games, late dinners, an apology I traded in for a spreadsheet that reconciled. My kids accepted the laptop as a sibling because it showed up more reliably than I did some nights. That trade felt reasonable until a single printed sheet put the bargain into question. Memory kept trying to rewind to how things used to be, not glamorous but precise. I remembered the first year I took on this client, how terrified I had been to send the initial forecast, how I stayed up until dawn calling colleagues, cross-checking assumptions, and rerunning scenarios until the model stopped surprising me. There was pride in that terror. The trust that followed had come not from a single triumph but from habit, a chain of small, boring, consistent choices that had taught others they could rely on my word. Right then, I felt the pressure of all those small choices concentrated into a single quiet interrogation. My throat was dry. I wanted to explain immediately, to lay out the version history and the notes and the red lines, anything to scaffold the conversation back to where I lived most comfortably, among facts and rehearsal. Instead, my mind supplied a different, colder thought. What if the thing that trembled was not a number but the scaffolding itself? What if the framework of my reliability had unseen cracks? I tried to steady my voice, imagining the cadence that had served me for years, calm, precise, unflappable. The room relied on that cadence the way a ship relied on ballast. To lose it here would not only unsettle the client. It would unsettle the steady rhythm in my own head that had kept panic at bay for a decade. I felt the old compulsion to fix things immediately, to make the ripples shrink into their original, orderly circles. But whatever the explanation was, something in me recognized this as an inflection point. The paper might have been small, but it carried the potential to rearrange everything I had carefully aligned. I inhaled and felt the air fill my lungs with the taste of toner and stale coffee and the faint citrus of the hand sanitizer someone used too often. The paper sat there, indifferent, its numbers ready to be read. I opened my mouth and the first words that came out were measured because I had practiced measurement my whole life. The conference room had shrunk, yes, but only the edges had moved. The center of me was steadier than I had supposed possible, if only because the alternative was chaos for other people whose days were aligned with my forecasts. That steadiness felt like responsibility and fear braided together, and as I spoke I realized how much of myself I had left in the margins of those reports. The betrayal was surgical and petty at once. Someone had taken my careful, conservative forecast pages of guarded assumptions and contingency lines that I had sleep-tested for weeks and replaced it with a glossy, exuberant projection before it went out the door. The file that hit the client's inbox had a brighter header, a few inflated cohort numbers, and a tone that read like a sales pitch instead of a ledger. The CFO did it herself. I later saw the outgoing message and the attachment she sent. She didn't look furtive about it. She smiled when the client lauded the uplift as if she'd pulled a brilliant trick on the market rather than gambled with other people's plans. I remember the exact pitch the client made in that meeting. With these numbers, we can fast-track the push into 3 new regions, double the ad spend, and onboard a vendor tomorrow. They said it with the certainty you'd reserve for an obvious fact. The words landed like river stones in a pool, each one rippling outward into hiring plans, vendor contracts, warehouse reorder schedules. I could hear the consequences being voiced: staffing requisitions that would open by next week, launch timelines advanced a quarter because budgets were not just columns on a page. They were promises that pushed through other organizations. The client wasn't being reckless, they were acting exactly as anyone would when handed an optimistic forecast with a senior market seal on it. When the quarter closed and reality failed to match the glossy projection, the room for explanation shrank until it fit in the palm of someone else's hand. Questions that should have been addressed to the sender landed on my desk. What assumptions changed? Why were these cohorts off? Had I misread the seasonality? People wanted a person to put the variance on, and those polite, pointed questions carried the tone of indictment rather than inquiry. My inbox filled with blunt, clipped messages. The client's account lead, someone who had trusted my cadence for years, phrased things as if I had knowingly given them bad directions. There were clear, provable signs that I did not invent the optimistic numbers. Server snapshots and archived drafts kept accurate revision histories. The outgoing email's audit trail bore the attachment that didn't match what I had prepared. File timestamps could tell a story that a room full of human faces seemed unwilling to hear. Yet evidence didn't have the same weight as a narrative voiced again and again by someone with authority. The CFO was practiced at optics. She could place a phrase that smoothed perception, and people are bored, the client, even some of my colleagues trusted the shape of her sentences. Politics is a machine that leans toward those who feed it narratives, and the version that advanced was tidier for people who wanted to believe the uplift had been corporate-approved rather than the result of a unilateral edit. Overnight, the ledger of my relationships changed in ways no spreadsheet had forecast. I went from being the steady center, the person who had, in some small way, kept other people's calendars honest, to being the anomaly in their plans. Meeting invitations arrived with new names in the from field. The junior analyst who used to sit next to me started scheduling follow-ups without copying me. People who had once nudged me toward the bar on Friday now pretended there were circuits they'd forgotten to clear when they saw me approaching. It was nothing dramatic at first. Small alterations in routing and tone that added up like incremental weight on a scale until I felt heavier for it. The shame was a physical thing. It settled behind my teeth like a cold metal taste and made my tongue thick with things I couldn't say. I found myself rehearsing apologies I hadn't committed to because someone had made it easier to pin blame on the visible face of delivery. Each phone call with a client became a session in liturgy. Questions were cross-examinations, and every number I spoke was parsed twice, thrice, for flaws I hadn't put there. Conversations that used to be collaborative felt adversarial. Emails demanded line-item reconciliations. Internal meetings required me to account for decisions I had not made. I could feel colleagues measuring my reliability like a commodity that had suddenly depreciated. Worse, the social smallness of it hurt more than the professional risk. Work is where I had built a version of myself that made sense to me, reliable, methodical, not flashy but trustworthy. To become someone colleagues whispered about in stairwells felt obscene and personal. The director who had produced the stack of papers in that first meeting avoided my aisle as if proximity might contaminate him. Even the junior analyst's eyes slid across me like I was a wet floor sign to be circumnavigated. Trust, which had been the unsaid contract between us, had been rescinded in small gestures that added up to exile. At home, the effect was softer but no less present. My partner noticed the drained set of my shoulders over dinner. The kids asked if I had to work late because I was sad, and I couldn't tell them the truth without shrinking into the part of myself that wanted to hide. I tried to keep the chaos from crossing the front door, but calls at odd hours and the sensation of my professional life unraveling made my presence elsewhere thin. The laptop, that second parent, felt heavier when I opened it. It carried not just spreadsheets but an accusation I hadn't earned. There was no dramatic firing line, no single email that said "you are the reason." Instead, it was the slow, bureaucratic unthreading of my role. Invitations rerouted, phrases rehearsed in executive meetings that minimized responsibility, and a polite distance that becomes a social verdict faster than any memo. I was left with the knowledge that competence hadn't been enough to protect me from someone who could rewrite a projection and then smile when the world believed the lie. Every incoming ring of my phone seemed like a summons. Every call that began with "Marcus, can you explain?" felt like standing before a bench where everyone else had already issued their judgment. I could feel myself splitting into two people. One that wanted to shout until the room agreed I had been framed, and another that counted the cost of shouting a man who still needed income, responsibility, the kind of steady paycheck that paid for piano lessons and orthodontist appointments. Both voices were loud enough to choke me, and for the first time in a long time, the one that wanted to survive professionally almost drowned out the one that wanted justice. The moment of clarity came on a late Thursday. We were alone in a glassed corner of the office, ostensibly to reconcile next quarter's numbers, but really because someone upstairs thought distance would keep things tidy. The CFO sat back in her chair like someone settling in to describe the weather. She spoke about optics and bonuses with the same flat, factual cadence people use to report precipitation. "Perception matters more than accuracy sometimes," she said, as if stating that umbrellas are useful when it rains. "If the market sees momentum, it creates momentum. There are incentives tied to hitting certain targets." She smiled, a small tilt of the mouth that had nothing to do with warmth. "We all have to play the long game." Her words slid off her tongue like practiced facts, and they landed in me like an accusation. For a moment I wanted to say, "But you swapped the file." But the sentence that followed her smile was the one that rewove the whole incident for me. She didn't think she'd crossed a line. To her, the edit was a lever you pull when the machinery needs nudging. To her, reputations and timelines were instruments, not the people who hold them. I remember the sound my teeth made when I closed my mouth. There was a dry click, and the office air felt suddenly thicker. She went on about quarterly incentives, about how an upbeat narrative could unlock marketing dollars and stave off board panic, as if the numbers themselves were secondary to the story they told. "People will forgive a miss if they believe the trajectory is right," she said. "Better to give them a reason to keep moving." It was small, clinical, and breathtaking in its selfishness. That was the precise moment the fracture snapped into a kind of clarity. This wasn't a one-off, an error made in haste. This was deliberate. It was a choice to reshape someone else's plans for your own advantage. The truth of that cold, naked, and small ignited something in me that had nothing to do with vindictiveness. It was an ember of clarity. I could either allow this to be sorted over hors d'oeuvres and corporate speak, letting the story of me as the fall guy calcify, or I could do something uglier and quieter. I could make sure the client got the truth, even if it meant burning every bridge that led back to me. I sat very still and counted the consequences as if they were ledger entries. Would I be invited to strategy sessions again? Could I sleep through the silence that would follow a public confrontation? Would my children's orthodontist accept our insurance if my job imploded? Each item had numbers attached. Each number had weight. The part of me that lived by calendars and contingency plans ran through scenarios with clinical detachment. What would losing this account mean financially? How long could we survive without the bonuses that were part of the role? Would the board rally around me or around the one with the better speechwriter? Risk, once quantified, loses some of its terror. The choice I made wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve storming into the CFO's office with accusations or drafting an angry resignation letter. I could see clearly that anger alone would be theater, and theater would let people file this away as an emotional eruption rather than a necessary correction. Instead, I made a different promise to myself, not a vow for retribution, but one rooted in the thing that had held my career together for 9 years. Integrity. I will protect the client, I told myself. It read simple on paper, but in my chest it felt like sealing an oath. I will protect my professional integrity even if it costs me everything. Saying it made the panic that had been tightening behind my ribs loosen a fraction. The moment the words settled, something else arrived, a methodical calm that felt less like composure and more like armor. It was not the buoyant confidence of someone sure they'll win. It was the steady, pragmatic clarity of someone who had decided which losses were tolerable and which were not. There was no sudden righteousness, just a slow, deliberate detachment from the theatricality of rage. I could hear the CFO's wind-quiet argument reverberating in my head. It had been rehearsed, measured, comfortable with its own moral opacity. In contrast, my resolve felt sharp and precise. If she was going to rewrite the story, I would make sure the client had the original script. I left that meeting quieter than I'd arrived, but not diminished. The hum of the office felt different, thicker with intent, and my hands moved with the strange steadiness of someone who has accepted the hard math of a decision. There was work to be done, but I no longer felt like I was pleading with fate. Panic had been removed like an untrustworthy advisor. In its place, I had a plan of sorts, not yet formed into steps, but formed enough to give me direction. For the first time since the paper hit the table, the sensation under my skin was not of breaking, but of bracing. The armor didn't make me invulnerable. It only made me deliberate, and that difference felt like the beginning of something irreversible. I moved like someone dismantling a clock, careful with each tiny gear so the thing could be put back together and prove what time it had really been. The first day after the meeting, I stopped talking to anyone who did not need to know what I was doing. My desk became an island of folders, every screen a different angle on the same fact pattern. I rebuilt the timeline the way I used to rebuild forecasts. Step 1, collect every input. Step 2, reconcile. Step 3, document anomalies until the anomalies could no longer be called accidents. I pulled the archived versions first. Our server kept nightly snapshots and version histories that looked dull until you knew what to look for. I copied the original spreadsheet, the one with my conservative assumptions and margin notes, into an encrypted folder on my laptop and then again onto a secure thumb drive I hid in a business card wallet. I am not proud of the thrill I felt at being more careful than the person who had betrayed me, but the care steadied my hands. Email headers were the next obsession. I learned to read the raw message source in ways I had not needed to before. The received lines, routing stamps, and content transfer encodings became a map of movement. In one header, the attachment name in the outgoing mail matched the edited file the client received. In another place, a forwarding entry bore the CFO's account and the timestamp that did not match the last saved time on the server file. I printed the headers and taped them into a notebook like evidence in a detective show, not for drama, but so I could see the sequence without switching screens. I dug into meeting recordings with a kind of slow satisfaction. We record quarterly reviews for the client. I pulled raw audio files, extracted the parts where numbers were read aloud, and matched them to versions. There was a short, meaningless laugh in one recording when the CFO described our trajectory as optimistic. It sounded like someone wiping their hands of responsibility. Pulling the audio into the folder made the moment less ephemeral. It was a piece of the story that could not be undone by a rehearsed apology. Drafts and red lines came next. I copied every email draft I had ever sent on the account, every track change and comment someone had made. Of particular interest were a few versions that showed line item adjustments that never made it into the file sent to the client and could not have been introduced except by someone with send privileges. The red line colors told a story of edits made by accounts outside our group. I made screenshots, annotated them, and saved them as images so the visual difference would be obvious even to someone who did not know Excel. I created a presentation not to deliver, but to think against. It was a messy thing, a series of slides that juxtaposed files with headers, timestamps with audio clips. I practiced arranging the order so the facts would read like a narrative and not like a hit list. I tested transitions in my head, show the server save, show the outgoing mail, show the edited copy. Let the facts land, do not speak over them. Let silence do the work where silence is persuasive. Nudging the client contact was delicate. I could not afford to make the meeting sound like a trap, and neither could I allow the client to be surprised by a confrontation. I sent a short note asking to add a line item to the regular review agenda, a reconciliation of last quarter's forecast and assumptions. I framed it as a service to them, a gesture of transparency. The message was honest enough to be credible and vague enough not to alarm my colleagues. When she replied with a time, relief cut through me like a cool hand. Practice became my second job. At night, I rehearsed the sequence. How to open the laptop, how long to wait before clicking to the next slide, where to place my hands on the table. I practiced neutral language until it felt like muscle memory. The goal was not to win emotional points, but to avoid giving anyone a reason to dismiss the presentation as motivated. I timed pauses so the client would have space to look, to notice dates, to see that the facts did not require my commentary to indict someone else. I also rehearsed silence. There were spots in the script where I would say nothing and where silence itself would be an instrument. You can watch a room change shape in that pause if you let it. Human beings like to fill in gaps. If I gave them the opening, they would assemble the implication without me having to utter it. That was part optics and part courage, to let the evidence do the talking and to accept the awkwardness that would follow. I built redundancies. Copies on the server, copies offline, paper copies in a folder that I could slide into my satchel if I needed to leave the office without notice. I made a list of witnesses who had heard versions read aloud in meetings and discreetly confirmed that they remembered certain lines. I cataloged the client-side emails where they referenced the optimistic numbers. Each item added weight to what could otherwise be framed as a he said, she said. The quiet work felt like laying bricks. I kept adding pieces until a wall began to look inevitable. Not dramatic, not headline-ready, just true. Each file, each header, each recording was a single brick. Alone they were unconvincing. Together they were a structure that held up under pressure. I did not tell anyone what I was building. I did not gloat when a new confirmatory file appeared. I collected and cataloged and rehearsed until the pattern no longer depended on my interpretation. When I closed the laptop at the end of those evenings, my hands were rough from the effort of being careful. My chest, though, had a kind of steady weight to it. Panic had been replaced by procedure. The armor was not a thing you could wear, but a set of preparations you could rely on. I slept in shorter increments and woke with the order of items in my head again, not as an obsession but as a list that would, if followed, force a truth into daylight. We need to clear the record, I said, and the practice that had been a second job for 2 weeks steadied my voice. I did not frame it as accusation. I framed it as service. I told them I would show 2 versions of the same forecast and let the facts speak. I clicked to the first slide, the server copy with my margin notes visible in faint cell comments, then to the second, the glossy file that had arrived in the client's inbox. They were side by side, same rows and columns, different truths. I walked them through the timeline exactly as I had rehearsed. Show the last saved time on the server. Show the metadata that indicated who had write privileges. Show the outgoing mail with the attached file name that matched the edited version. Show the audit log entries that linked a session to the CFO's credentials at a time after my saved copy and before the client received the file. I moved through each piece with the economy of a person who had practiced refraining from rhetorical flair. Facts do the work or they do not. As each fact appeared, the room became quieter. It is a strange sensation to watch attention fold toward a string of characters on a screen the way water finds the lowest place. The client's lead, Jenna, leaned forward until her elbow pressed into the table. Her face had gone pale in the way sleep wears thin. The CFO's practiced smile finally cracked. Her hands wandered for a moment as if she could touch the screen and smooth the difference away. I played a short audio clip that I had clipped from a recorded review. The snippet was 30 seconds long and contained a laugh that sounded like a hand washing itself of responsibility. You could see the effect immediately. People do not always remember laughter, but they remember the cadence of a voice when it performs a particular kindness for itself. The CFO shifted in her chair. Her explanation when it came was the one I had heard a dozen times in those earlier meetings about optics, momentum, incentives. It sounded thin against the evidence. I let silence do the work in the pauses where the logistics of time spelled deception. Silence is an instrument if you trust your material. I had learned to hold it so the room would supply its own commentary, the way a crowd supplies applause when it feels the right cue. The client looked from spreadsheet to headers to audio and then at the person who had signed that outgoing note. She did not need me to say the word, her expression asked it anyway. The CFO tried to reframe the record like a magician covering a misdirected move. She said words about expedited timelines and miscommunication. She proposed a narrative about last-minute changes and human error. Her voice rose and then went small when the audit logs did not cooperate with her story. Each page I brought up cut off another possible excuse until the only thing left on her side was a choice and its trace. At that point, Jenna reached for the phone. She spoke in clipped sentences that suddenly made everything sound legal. Contracts, she said, must be paused pending review. We need to confirm the historical numbers before any further commitments. She asked to have authorities on their side review the files and asked that no one else touch the server copy until counsel had looked. Her practical voice carried weight, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something like relief instead of vindictiveness. HR arrived a few minutes later to observe and to log the meeting. Someone in our legal team slipped in and made notes. The power in the room changed shape like a folded paper when you press center. The person whose hands had tried to redraw the map of truth sat small under the weight of documented timestamps and headers. It is odd how thin authority can look when stripped of plausible deniability. People who had nodded at her plans for years did not know where to sit with the new picture. No one applauded. There was no grand exodus. The meeting dissolved into procedural moves that would ripple outward: counsel to review, files to be quarantined, HR to open an investigation. Jenna's question hung like a demand. We want to know the motive, not only the mechanics. The CFO answered with a sentence about pressure to meet numbers and incentives to present growth in a certain light. The repetition of later rationalizations felt small and rehearsed beside the concrete chain of events on the screen. After the technical presentation, I stepped back and let others take the next steps. That was not avoidance. It was an act of control learned from years of stewarding others through forecasts. I had given them the map of the path, and the rest would be walked under observation. People clustered into groups, some whispering under their breath, some sitting stunned, some already dialing their lawyers. My colleagues looked at me, eyes asking whether I wanted to speak further. I did not. I wanted the story to be adjudicated on the evidence I had laid out, not my telling of it. The CFO left the room first. She did not slam a door. She did not glare. Her departure was an absence that said more than an argument. People who had deferred to her in meetings now walked past her with an awkward, uninvested politeness. Power in an office is a social contract, and when you expose the gaps in that contract, the ledger changes hands. I noticed the shift not because it elevated me, but because it made the room make sense again. The client was no longer buying an altered view of the future. They had the facts, and they would decide whether to trust the partner who had supplied them. I felt the old adrenaline uniquely quiet, like after a long run when the body cools and the heart remembers the effort. I did not savor the moment. When the procedural machinery started to hum, when the cadence shifted toward audit and counsel, I felt something closer to the relief of an obligation fulfilled. The truth was now an object in the room to be examined. The work had been done. What happened next would not be my immediate responsibility, though I knew it would change a lot of things. The weeks afterward felt like the slow unwinding of a tight spring. Meetings multiplied, not the strategic, forward-looking kind I had lived for, but the defensive work of auditors, counsel, and HR trying to turn a raw moment into a clean record. Promotions were put on hold until the audit finished. Budgets were frozen in places I had never thought to look. My inbox filled with polite queries and requests for clarification that were thinly veiled ways of checking where everyone stood. The company performed that old, familiar ritual of pausing to reassess who it trusted, and the pause was loud. The CFO took an internal leave and then, eventually, departed in a way that felt almost surgical compared to the drama I had feared. There was no resignation speech, no denials shouted in corridors, only a terse statement, an exit meeting, and the slow decoupling of her name from the projects she had once directed. People who had deferred to her moved more slowly, as if their habit of obedience had to be relearned. The client stopped seeing her as a mouthpiece and started seeing me as someone who would bring them an honest map, even when the terrain was rough. Jenna sent an email that I read 3 times before replying. It was uncluttered and formal and full of a kind of cautious warmth I had not expected. She thanked me for the transparency and for acting in the client's interest, not in the interest of spin. Her words mattered because they came from someone who had lost money and time because of someone else's choice. She restored a professional trust that had been endangered, and in doing so made it possible for me to keep doing the work I loved. That restoration felt practical and fragile all at once, like a bridge with new bolts in it. Not everything repaired itself. I lost friends in ways that felt small and sharp. A few colleagues who had been close now avoided looking me in the eye in the halls. I could hear the calculus in their silence. Some who had smiled in meeting rooms now found reasons to be busy at the least convenient moments. Those losses were not dramatic betrayals. They were private decisions about association and risk. They cut because they were unexpected. Competence, I had believed, was a kind of currency that bought protection. That belief was naive. People trade on more than skill. They trade allegiance, convenience, and sometimes their own image. Sleep left me for a while. My mind would reel through spreadsheet cells and email headers at 3 in the morning, convinced I had missed a timestamp or a clause. I found myself replaying the tiny choices I had made, testing whether I had moved carefully enough, whether I had left openings. Over time, the adrenaline thinned. I began to sleep again. The nightmares did not vanish overnight, but they lost their urgency. Relief, not exaltation, arrived. It did not taste like the bitter sweetness of winning. It tasted like the end of an obligation fulfilled, like the body relaxing after a long day of holding tension. What surprised me most was the clarity I gained about where I draw lines. Before this, I thought those lines were obvious. After, they felt like things I had to articulate and defend. Saying I would protect the client and my integrity was straightforward in a meeting. Living that promise required stubbornness and the willingness to make practical sacrifices, like awkward conversations and nights without sleep. I learned to make the cost explicit to myself. Integrity, I discovered, operates as both shield and tool. It protects you from being co-opted into bad outcomes, and it is the instrument you use to set the terms of future interactions. The quiet work of assembling evidence had felt tedious while I was doing it. Sorting metadata and server logs does not have the glamour of deliverables or the social payoff of a successful client dinner. Yet that work spoke in a room better than any speech could. People are inclined to believe narratives that are easy, and evidence is the thing that complicates the easy story. The realization that methodical, patient documentation can be the loudest voice in a dispute changed how I thought about my job. I had always been precise for accuracy. Now I saw precision as a form of defense and a way to make truth credible. At home, the dynamics shifted too. My wife, who had been quiet through the whole thing, started asking practical questions about contingency plans, about what would happen if the company reacted poorly. Our kids stayed blissfully uninterested, as children do, assigning their most precious decisions to their screens. That mundanity was grounding. It reminded me why I did the job beyond ambition. The forecasts were about other people's livelihoods and plans. That weight had felt abstract until it was made real by someone else's choice to choose convenience over truth. There is a kind of humility that follows events like this. I am less convinced that being right is sufficient. I am more convinced that being scrupulous matters in concrete ways. I do not feel vindicated. I feel steadier, which in its own way is better. The office settled into a new normal. People rearranged their maps of who to trust. I kept doing my work with an added caution and a new readiness to document the small things that too often get taken for granted. If the episode taught me anything, it is this: when the stakes are real, the patient accumulation of facts is a kind of moral force. It will not feel dramatic, and it will not always be thanked. But it makes truth usable, and that is a power I learned to respect.